Hi Year 10 and welcome to this podcast about Piaget. What we are going to look at in this podcast is how we apply some of Piaget's ideas to education. To get the most out of this podcast, you need to have pen and paper ready so you can take some notes. The reason for this is that you will learn much better if you take some notes while you're listening. You can of course always go back and re-listen to the podcast. We're going to look at Piaget's key stages. We're going to look at the concept of readiness. We're going to look at active learning. We're going to look at the concept of intelligence. And finally, I'm going to tell you how the British government used Piaget's idea to improve education in the United Kingdom. But let's go back and start with the key stages. The first key stage is the sensory motor stage. And that happens from when the child is born till they're 2 years old. The way the child learns during that stage is through very basic actions such as sucking or grasping, looking and listening. And what the infants are learning at that stage is that things continue to exist even though they can't actually see them. They also understand that they're separate beings from people and the objects around them. In the pre-operational stage, which is the next stage from when you're 2 to 7 years old, at this stage, children start to learn and think about symbolic things, and they also learn to use words and pictures to represent objects. Whilst they're getting better at speaking and at thinking, they still tend to think and learn in very concrete terms. In the next stage, which is called the concrete operational stage, when we are from 7 to 11 years old, we suddenly start to learn in a very different way. The reason for this is that we start thinking logically about events. For example, at that stage, we understand the concept of conservation. What that means, for example, is that you can have an amount of liquid in a short, wide cup. And you know that it is exactly the same and equal to when the liquid is put into a tall, skinny glass. So this is a more logical way of thinking and learning. In the formal operational stage, which is from the age of 12 and upwards, your learning gets even more sophisticated. At this stage, a teenager or a young adult can actually start to learn and think abstractly. And they can also think about problems that are actually hypothetically. So for example, you can now learn and think about moral, philosophical, ethical, social and political issues, which requires you to understand theories and abstract reasoning. So for example, at that stage, because you have a more logic way of learning, you can then reason and you can have a general principle, but you can actually think about very specific information about that principle. The next thing we are going to learn about and revise is readiness. Readiness is basically the concept that a child should only be taught when they are in the right stage. So that means they must have an appropriate cognitive development. And cognitive development is basic about your thinking skills. So let me give you an example about that. For example, according to Piaget, there is no point in teaching a child about, say, moral or philosophical, ethical or social issues when they are in the pre-operational stage. You remember that the pre-operational stage was from 2 to 7 years old, and at that stage, according to Piaget, they are not able to understand moral, philosophical and ethical issues and learn about them. Because to do that, you need to be in the formal operational stage, which is at the age of 12 and upwards. Active learning was extremely important for Piaget. And what that basically means is that if you're going to learn, and if you're going to remember what you have learned, you need to do it in an active manner, not being passive. An example of that is, of course, when you're taking notes right now. You're being an active learner instead of just sitting and listening. Finally, the concept of intelligence. What Piaget discovered was that intelligence was a form of adaptation. Let me give you an example of what adaptation is. For example, if you look at a concept called assimilation, Piaget said that you would actually learn from noticing several things. For example, you might know that a deer has got antlers, and that's why you know it's a deer. But one day, you might see a deer that has no antlers, and you then realize that deers can have antlers and not, but they are still deers. So what you are doing is you are merging different pieces of information, and you adapt that information into one understanding of what a deer is. Finally, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how Piaget's ideas were used in primary education in the United Kingdom. In 1966, the British government decided that it was time to look at primary education and change it. And what they did was they used some of Piaget's ideas, namely the stages that we just talked about. They looked at readiness and active learning and the concept of intelligence to improve primary education in the United Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And now it's time for you either to listen to it again and make some more notes and then do the quiz. Bye for now.